Imagine being born into absolute power and realizing, far too late, that power will never belong to you. Imagine growing up surrounded by marble halls, gold-threaded fabrics, and servants who bow at every step, only to discover that all of it is decoration around a cage. A cage designed not to protect you, but to shape you, to prepare you, to break you quietly. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was feared by its enemies and admired by the world. It commanded armies, ruled continents, and shaped history itself. But hidden deep within its palaces was a reality so carefully managed, so psychologically precise, that it rarely appears in textbooks, a reality that did not unfold on battlefields, but inside the lives of the empire's own daughters. This is not a story of scandal. It is not a story of spectacle. It is a story of control, of obedience, of what happens when a human life is reduced to a political instrument before it ever has the chance to become a person. This is the story of what it truly meant to be an Ottoman princess. From the outside, the Imperial Palace appeared to be a place of unmatched refinement. Music echoed through courtyards. Scholars debated philosophy beneath shaded arches. Calligraphy, astronomy, poetry, and law were treated as sacred pursuits. The daughters of the Sultan were educated in all of these disciplines. They learned languages, history, theology, and etiquette with astonishing rigor. But education was never freedom, it was preparation. From the moment a princess was born, her future had already been negotiated, not written in ink, but embedded into the logic of empire. She would not rule, she would not choose, she would serve as a guarantee. Ottoman princesses were not raised to inherit power, they were raised to stabilize it. Their lives existed to reinforce loyalty, reward obedience, and neutralize potential threats within the ruling elite. Marriage was not a personal milestone. It was a political deployment, and unlike the concubines of the imperial harem, many of whom, paradoxically, could rise to immense influence, the princesses had no upward path. Royal blood did not elevate them, it confined them. To understand how severe this confinement was, one must understand the psychological architecture of the empire itself. The Ottomans believed deeply in order, in hierarchy, in the idea that stability depended on every individual knowing their place and remaining within it. For men, this often meant opportunity. For women, especially royal women, it meant erasure of the self in service of continuity. Princesses were taught this lesson early. Their childhoods were carefully monitored. Tutors praised intelligence, but discouraged curiosity. Questions were allowed only within narrow boundaries. Emotional expression was subtly corrected. Independence was gently, persistently discouraged. By adolescence, most princesses already understood an unspoken truth. Their thoughts were their own only until they conflicted with duty, and then came the moment when duty became unavoidable. When a princess reached what the court deemed a suitable age, often far earlier than we would consider reasonable today, discussions began, not with her, round her. Senior officials, advisors, and the Sultan himself evaluated political needs. Which military commander required loyalty? Which provincial governor needed reassurance? Which alliance required reinforcement? The princess's name was placed into these calculations like a seal waiting to be stamped. Once a decision was made, it was final. There was no appeal, no negotiation, no space for refusal. The marriage was announced as an honor, a privilege, a celebration of imperial grace. Publicly, it was framed as elevation. Privately, it was understood as surrender. What followed was not courtship, it was conditioning. In the months leading up to the wedding, a princess entered a phase of preparation that had little to do with celebration and everything to do with compliance. Older women of the court, many of whom had endured the same process decades earlier, were tasked with overseeing her transformation. These women were not cruel in the theatrical sense. They were methodical, efficient, convinced that what they were doing was necessary. The princess was instructed in ritualized behavior down to the smallest detail. How to walk, how to sit, how to lower her gaze, how to speak, and more importantly, when not to speak. Silence became a discipline. Stillness became a virtue. Every gesture was rehearsed until it became instinct. Not elegance for its own sake, but predictability. A body that moved exactly as expected was a body that could be controlled. Language, too, was restricted. The range of acceptable responses narrowed. Gratitude, agreement, apology, acceptance. The words available to describe inner experience slowly disappeared. Over time, even thoughts began to reshape themselves around what could be safely expressed. This was not education, it was psychological narrowing, and the princess was not unaware of what was happening. On some level, she understood that she was being reshaped for a role she had not chosen. That understanding, however, had nowhere to go. Resistance would not save her. It would only accelerate punishment. So the mind learned to bend. What the empire demanded was not rebellion crushed by force, but obedience achieved through exhaustion. As the wedding approached, isolation increased. The princess was removed from familiar routines and placed into seclusion. This was framed as protection, purification, and focus. In reality, it served a deeper purpose. Isolation breaks reference points. Without familiar voices, without unsupervised conversation, without the grounding of ordinary time, the mind becomes vulnerable. Reflection turns inward. Fear has space to grow. Authority becomes absolute because there is nothing to compare it to. During this period, the princess was surrounded by symbols of ideal womanhood as defined by the empire. Tapestries, texts, and stories emphasized patience, endurance, and sacrifice. Submission was presented not as loss, but as virtue. Self-erasure was reframed as devotion. Religion was woven into this framework carefully. Faith itself was not the issue. Instrumentalized faith was. Prayer became structure. Ritual became reinforcement. Obedience was no longer merely political, it was moral. By the time the wedding day arrived, the transformation was largely complete. The princess did not need to be forced. She had been trained not to resist. The wedding itself was a spectacle of grandeur. The city celebrated. Feasts were prepared. Music filled the streets. From the outside, it appeared as a triumph of empire, tradition, and continuity. Inside the palace, the princess moved through the ceremony like a figure in a painting, present but distant, observed but not truly seen. Contemporary records note the physical signs of distress. Many princesses displayed during these events: trembling, loss of appetite, faintness, detachment. What we would now recognize as severe anxiety was then interpreted as fragility, sensitivity, or even virtue. The empire had no language for psychological injury, only for compliance and deviation. After the public rituals concluded, the princess was led away from the celebration into a private space. Designed with symbolic precision, architecture itself became part of the process. Each threshold marked a transition, from daughter to wife, from person to possession. What happened behind those doors was never meant to be discussed openly. It did not need to be. Silence was part of the system. Observers recorded outcomes, not experiences. The empire was concerned with function, not feeling. And when the night ended, whatever remained of the girl who had once studied poetry or gazed at the stars was often gone. The aftermath was rarely acknowledged publicly. Some princesses withdrew into near-total silence. Others developed what court physicians described in vague, clinical terms: melancholy, nervous conditions, weakness of spirit. These labels were not meant to heal. They were meant to categorize. Modern psychology gives us clearer language: trauma, dissociation, depression, anxiety disorders. But such concepts did not exist within the imperial framework. There was no room for understanding pain that did not serve a purpose. Treatment focused on restoring function. Music, herbs, religious exercises. None of these addressed the root cause, because the root cause was the system itself. Many princesses lived long lives after their marriages. They bore children, attended ceremonies, fulfilled obligations. From the outside, their lives appeared stable, even privileged. Internally, many were empty. Their intellectual pursuits faded. Their curiosity dimmed. The women who had once been praised for intelligence learned that thinking too deeply only sharpened the ache of what had been lost. Silence became survival. Some husbands recognized the damage, others did not. Some felt guilt, others entitlement. The system did not require cruelty, only participation, and participation was expected. It is important to understand that these stories are not anomalies. Archival fragments, memoirs, and correspondence reveal patterns repeated across generations. Princesses who vanished from records. Princesses whose deaths were quietly noted and quickly forgotten. Princesses whose names survive only as footnotes to political agreements. The empire was efficient at erasure. What makes this history particularly unsettling is not its distance from us, but its familiarity. Power still reshapes lives. Systems still prioritize stability over humanity. Women, especially those closest to power, are still often asked to sacrifice themselves for narratives they did not write. The Ottoman Empire did not invent this dynamic. It refined it, and within that refinement lies the true tragedy. These women were not crushed by chaos. They were carefully, deliberately shaped into silence by order. When we imagine princesses of the past, we often imagine privilege without cost, luxury without consequence, protection without loss. The reality was far more complex. To be an Ottoman princess was to live at the intersection of reverence and erasure, to be educated, admired, and controlled in equal measure, to be told that your value lay not in who you were, but in what you could secure for others. For many, death was not the worst fate. Oblivion of the self was. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of this history. That suffering does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in ceremony, justified by tradition, and enforced through obedience. The voices of these women were not lost because they were weak. They were lost because the world they lived in did not want to hear them. As we uncover these stories now, centuries later, we are not changing the past, but we are challenging the silence that protected power for so long. And in doing so, we are reminded of something deeply human. That dignity cannot survive where choice does not exist. That obedience demanded at the cost of identity is not virtue, but tragedy. And that the echoes of agony do not fade simply because history stops listening.